April 22nd, 1941, 3:47 hours, English Channel, 12 miles northwest of Calais. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Bauer commanded the destroyer Hermann Schumann, leading 3 escort vessels on routine patrol through waters Germany controlled. The French coast lay behind him, occupied and secure. The Royal Navy was nowhere visible. British destroyers had withdrawn north after recent encounters with Luftwaffe bombers. Bauer stood on the bridge, relaxed, smoking a cigarette, while his crew conducted standard watch procedures. The night was clear enough for visual navigation, dark enough that British aircraft wouldn't spot them. The shell arrived without warning. Bauer never saw it in flight. What he saw was the column of water that erupted 300 meters ahead of his destroyer, a geyser that rose higher than his ship's mast, white and violent against the dark sea. The shock wave hit seconds later, rattling Hermann Schumann's hull hard enough that Bauer grabbed the bridge rail for support. His cigarette fell from his fingers. "Incoming!" the lookout screamed. Before Bauer could process what was happening, a second shell landed closer, 200 meters off the starboard bow. Then a third, this one barely 50 meters from the hull, close enough that spray drenched the forward deck. The explosions created a pattern, walking toward his ship with methodical precision that suggested the gunner could see exactly where each shell landed and was adjusting fire with terrifying accuracy. Bauer's first thought was that British cruisers had somehow approached unseen. He ordered the bridge crew to scan the horizon for warships, but the lookouts reported nothing. No vessels, no gun flashes, nothing except empty darkness in all directions except the French coast behind them and the invisible British coast ahead. "Impossible," Bauer muttered. "No ship can fire from that range." A fourth shell landed so close that fragments struck the destroyer's hull, punching small holes in the plating. The sound was distinctive, not the sharp crack of a nearby gun, but a deep, rushing roar that suggested enormous projectiles traveling from far away. Bauer had been shelled by British destroyers before. This was different. These shells were massive, and they were arriving from a distance that exceeded any warship's effective range. Then Bauer understood, and the realization was worse than any surface engagement he'd experienced. "It's not the Royal Navy," he said, his voice tight. "It's Britain's coastal guns. They're firing from the shore." He ordered emergency turn to port, full speed, course directly toward French-held territory. Hermann Schumann responded instantly, heeling over as the engines drove the destroyer toward the only safety available, distance from the British coast. The other escort vessels followed without waiting for orders, their captains reaching the same conclusion. Remaining in range meant certain destruction. The British guns kept firing. Shells landed around the fleeing destroyers in patterns that demonstrated the gunners were tracking moving targets, adjusting aim to compensate for speed and bearing. One shell landed so close to the trailing escort that the explosion damaged the vessel's steering, forcing it to slow while the crew made emergency repairs. Bauer wanted to assist, but remaining in range would have cost both ships. He kept running, hating himself for abandoning the damaged vessel, but understanding that coastal batteries killed ships that stayed within range. The shelling stopped when Hermann Schumann crossed some invisible line that marked the maximum effective range. Bauer's navigator calculated they'd fled 17 miles from the British coast before the guns ceased fire. 17 miles. Most German naval guns couldn't engage targets accurately beyond 12 miles. The British were shooting from positions they couldn't even see, hitting targets with shells that weighed more than a man, demonstrating fire control that seemed impossible for guns mounted on land. The damaged escort limped back 3 hours later, listing slightly, reporting 2 dead and 5 wounded from fragments. Its captain's report was brief. The British shore batteries fire like battleships. We cannot operate within their range. We cannot fight back. They can see us, and we cannot see them. Bauer filed his incident report with honest assessment that contradicted German naval doctrine. British coastal defences represent greater threat to surface operations than Royal Navy destroyer forces. The guns fire from positions beyond our effective engagement range, with accuracy that suggests advanced fire control systems. German surface vessels cannot suppress these batteries. Operations within 20 miles of British coast are no longer viable unless these positions are neutralized through air attack or assault. The response from German Naval Command came within 48 hours. Avoid British coastal waters except when absolutely necessary. Accept that British shores were protected by weapons that German destroyers couldn't engage effectively. Plan operations around the assumption that British coastal guns controlled all approaches to their territory. For Korvettenkapitän Bauer and every German naval officer who received that directive, the message was clear. Britain had turned its coastline into a weapon more dangerous than its fleet, the fortress coast. Britain's decision to fortify its coastline with heavy naval artillery emerged from strategic calculation that recognized naval vessels were mobile but vulnerable, while coastal positions were fixed but nearly invulnerable. The concept wasn't revolutionary. Coastal fortifications had protected harbors and strategic positions for centuries. What made Britain's approach distinctive was the scale and sophistication of the installations, combined with the caliber of weapons deployed. These weren't simple defensive batteries meant to deter small raids. These were fortress systems designed to engage capital ships at maximum range, using guns salvaged from decommissioned battleships and mounted in positions where they couldn't be sunk, couldn't be outmaneuvered, and couldn't be effectively suppressed by anything except sustained aerial bombardment or ground assault. The program accelerated dramatically after Dunkirk, when Britain recognized that invasion was imminent and that the Royal Navy, however powerful, couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. Coastal batteries provided defense that didn't depend on ship availability, that couldn't be drawn out of position by feints or diversions, and that created permanent danger zones where German vessels operated at constant risk. The weapons installed ranged from 6-inch guns suitable for engaging destroyers and merchant vessels to 15-inch naval rifles that could engage battleships at ranges exceeding 20 miles. The largest installations used guns that had been removed from scrapped or damaged capital ships, weapons designed for naval warfare, but adapted to coastal defense through mounting in reinforced concrete emplacements with ammunition stores deep underground and fire control systems housed in bomb-proof facilities. Dover became the most heavily fortified position, facing German-occupied France across the narrowest part of the Channel. The batteries there included 14-inch guns nicknamed Winnie and Pooh by their crews, capable of firing shells weighing nearly 1,300 pounds across 23 miles of water. These guns engaged German positions on the French coast in artillery duels that became routine throughout 1940 and 1941, with British and German batteries exchanging fire across the Channel in battles that achieved limited tactical results but demonstrated that Britain controlled its own waters absolutely. St. Margaret's Battery mounted 15-inch guns, the same weapons used on Queen Elizabeth-class battleships in positions overlooking the Dover Strait. These guns could engage any vessel attempting to use the Channel, creating a zone where German surface ships operated at extreme risk regardless of Royal Navy presence. The installation included underground magazines, power generation facilities, and accommodation for crews that numbered over 200 men per battery. Portsmouth, Plymouth, Scapa Flow, and dozens of smaller positions received similar treatment, though typically with smaller caliber weapons appropriate to local threats. The result was a defensive system that extended around Britain's entire coastline, with overlapping fields of fire that ensured any German vessel approaching British waters would be detected and engaged long before it reached effective range for its own weapons. The fire control systems represented the installation's most sophisticated element. Britain had developed advanced optical range-finding equipment during World War I, and those systems were refined and expanded for coastal defense. Observation posts positioned along the coast provided overlapping coverage, using triangulation to determine target positions with accuracy that allowed first-round hits at extreme range. The data was transmitted to plotting rooms where fire control officers calculated trajectories, corrected for wind and weather, and directed guns to engage targets the gunners themselves couldn't see. By late 1940, Britain was installing early radar systems at major coastal batteries, providing all-weather detection capability that made the installations even more dangerous. German vessels discovered they couldn't use darkness or poor visibility to avoid detection. British radar could track them beyond visual range, and coastal guns would open fire through fog or night with accuracy that seemed impossible. The psychological impact on German naval operations was substantial. Captains accustomed to engaging enemy vessels in situations where both sides had roughly equivalent capabilities found themselves facing weapons they couldn't fight. A destroyer could dodge torpedoes, evade dive bombers, even flee from larger warships. But coastal batteries were fixed in position, had unlimited ammunition compared to ships, and couldn't be sunk. The only defense was staying beyond their range, which meant abandoning large sections of water to British control. Operation Sea Lion's impossible math. German planning for invasion of Britain collapsed when naval staff calculated the losses that coastal batteries would inflict on landing forces attempting to cross the Channel. The invasion plan required transporting approximately 160,000 troops across the Channel in the first wave, using converted river barges, small merchant vessels, and whatever other craft could be assembled. These vessels were slow, maximum speed, perhaps 8 knots, unarmored, and incapable of evasive maneuvers. They would require approximately 8 to 12 hours to cross the Channel from French ports to British beaches, depending on embarkation points and tidal conditions. British coastal batteries could engage these vessels continuously throughout the crossing. Dover's guns alone covered the narrowest part of the Channel completely, with overlapping fire from batteries at Deal and St. Margaret's providing redundant coverage. Any invasion fleet using the shortest crossing route would be under fire from 15-inch and 14-inch guns for the entire passage, with smaller batteries engaging as the barges approached closer to shore. The mathematical projection was devastating. British batteries could fire approximately 6 rounds per gun per minute, slower than ship-mounted weapons due to heavier shells and more complex loading procedures, but fast enough to engage multiple targets continuously. Dover's batteries alone could place perhaps 24 shells into the Channel every minute. Even with relatively poor accuracy against small, numerous targets, the volume of fire would achieve substantial hits over the 8-hour crossing period. Each 15-inch shell that hit a barge would sink it instantly. The vessels had no armor, minimal subdivision, and carried troops packed tightly together to maximize transport capacity. Near misses from shells weighing 1,500 pounds would swamp smaller craft, damage propulsion, or kill exposed personnel. German planners calculated that coastal batteries could sink or damage 10% of the invasion fleet before it reached British beaches. 16,000 troops killed or rendered ineffective, along with loss of the vessels needed to transport follow-on waves. The losses would compound as surviving barges reached shallower water. British batteries had pre-registered every potential landing beach, meaning gunners already had firing solutions calculated for standard approach routes. As barges slowed to navigate coastal obstacles and final approach to beaches, they would be essentially stationary targets for guns that had been firing at them for hours and had refined their aim progressively. The final 1,000 meters of approach would see catastrophic losses as British gunners concentrated fire on craft attempting to land. Even if substantial numbers of troops reached beaches alive, they would be without heavy equipment. German planning called for landing tanks and artillery in the first waves to provide fire support against British defences. But tanks loaded aboard barges represented enormous targets that coastal batteries would prioritise. A single hit would sink the barge, destroy the tank, and kill most of the crew. Artillery pieces were similarly vulnerable. The invasion force that actually reached shore would likely be light infantry without effective heavy weapons, facing British defenders who retained their artillery, their armour, and their fortifications. Admiral Raeder, commanding German naval forces, reported to Hitler that Operation Sea Lion could not succeed unless British coastal batteries were neutralized before the invasion fleet sailed. Luftwaffe bombing campaigns attempted this, targeting known battery positions with heavy raids throughout autumn 1940. But the installations proved nearly impossible to destroy through air attack. The guns themselves were mounted in reinforced concrete emplacements, ammunition was stored underground, and fire control facilities were dispersed and hardened against bombing. Luftwaffe attacks achieved some temporary damage, but never suppressed the batteries sufficiently to make invasion viable. By late 1940, German naval staff privately acknowledged that crossing the Channel against operational British coastal defences was impossible without accepting losses that would cripple the invasion before it began. The operation was postponed indefinitely, then quietly cancelled. Britain's coastal guns hadn't fired a shot at invasion barges, but they'd prevented the invasion through their mere existence. Weapons that couldn't be neutralized, couldn't be bypassed, and would inflict catastrophic losses on any force attempting to cross waters they controlled. The convoy shield. British coastal batteries provided protection for coastal convoys that allowed merchant shipping to continue operating in waters that would otherwise have been too dangerous to use. German E-boats, fast attack craft similar to British MTBs, operated from French and Belgian ports, conducting raids against British coastal shipping. These vessels were fast enough to avoid most escorts, carried torpedoes that could sink merchant ships with single hits, and operated at night when visual detection was difficult. The threat forced Britain to suspend some coastal convoy routes or accept substantial losses to attacks that Royal Navy escorts couldn't prevent. Coastal batteries changed this calculus by making waters near British shores extremely dangerous for German attack craft. E-boats could evade destroyers, but they couldn't outrun shells from coastal guns. The vessels relied on speed and maneuverability, but those advantages were meaningless when British observation posts could track them through radar and direct battery fire against targets that could be engaged faster than they could escape. German E-boat commanders discovered that approaching within range of British coastal batteries was suicidal. The guns would open fire while the attack craft were still miles from convoy targets, forcing them to evade incoming shells rather than conduct attacks. E-boats attempting to press attacks would find themselves under sustained fire from batteries that could track them continuously, placing shells ahead of their course with accuracy that made survival unlikely if they maintained their approach. The result was that German E-boats were effectively excluded from waters within 20 miles of British shores, precisely the zone where coastal convoys operated. Merchant ships could sail along the British coast with minimal escort, knowing that German attack craft couldn't approach without being engaged by batteries that made such approaches suicidal. Convoys that would have required substantial destroyer escort in open water could operate with minimal protection in coastal waters, freeing those destroyers for other missions. The tonnage statistics documented this protection's value. Coastal convoys in 1941 and 1942 suffered far fewer losses than equivalent convoys in open water or in areas beyond coastal battery range. German E-boats concentrated their attacks on convoys operating in waters where British coastal guns couldn't provide coverage, accepting that waters within battery range were effectively closed to surface attack. The invisible wall created by British coastal artillery saved thousands of tons of shipping and allowed Britain to maintain coastal trade despite German control of continental ports across the Channel. The lasting effect. British coastal batteries remained operational throughout the war, continuing to protect approaches to British waters even as the strategic situation evolved and invasion threat receded. The installations required substantial resources to maintain: crews to man the guns, ammunition to maintain ready stocks, maintenance to keep systems operational. But the investment was justified by the security they provided. British shores remained immune to surface attack throughout the war. German naval forces never seriously threatened British coastal waters after 1941. The batteries that had been installed as emergency defense against invasion proved valuable for years beyond their initial purpose. The guns engaged their last targets in 1944 during preparations for D-Day, when British batteries fired counter-battery missions against German installations on the French coast. The exchanges were brief. German crews had learned during years of sporadic dueling that British fire control was superior, and casualties in sustained exchanges were unacceptable. British batteries suppressed German coastal guns efficiently, allowing Allied invasion preparations to proceed without interference from German artillery across the Channel. After the war, most coastal batteries were gradually decommissioned. The guns were dismantled, the emplacements abandoned, or converted to other uses. The massive installations that had protected Britain during its most dangerous period became historical curiosities, too expensive to maintain and no longer relevant to naval warfare, that now centered on aircraft carriers and submarines rather than surface gunnery. But during the critical years from 1940 to 1943, when Britain stood alone and invasion remained a genuine threat, those coastal batteries represented security that no fleet of destroyers could have provided. They were weapons that couldn't be sunk, couldn't be evaded, and couldn't be defeated through conventional naval combat. They made British shores into a fortress that extended dozens of miles into the sea, creating zones where German vessels operated at risk that exceeded any tactical advantage their missions might achieve. For Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Bauer and every German naval officer who experienced coastal battery fire, the lesson was permanent. Some weapons created fear not through their destructive power alone, but through their invulnerability. A battleship was impressive, but could be sunk. A fortress carved into a cliff, mounting guns that fired shells weighing more than men, protected by reinforced concrete that no torpedo could penetrate and no shell could destroy reliably. That fortress was terrifying, precisely because it couldn't be defeated. German captains feared British coastal guns more than the Royal Navy because ships could be fought, could be evaded, could be sunk. The guns could only be avoided, and avoiding them meant conceding control of British waters to weapons that had been positioned there precisely to make German operations impossible. Britain had turned its coastline into the largest warship in the world, one that couldn't move, couldn't be sunk, and fired shells from positions that German destroyers couldn't effectively engage. That warship never sailed anywhere, but it protected Britain absolutely throughout the years when protection mattered most.